Welcome, everybody, to episode 11 of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. Today, I'm very happy and excited to have with us Rachana Umashankar. She's an associate professor of Islam at Iona University in New York. She has worked and taught there for the last 10 years and completed her PhD studies of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She loves teaching a lot, so it's really her calling. And as for significant others, Rachana has let me know that she describes herself a bit as a cat lady, dog lady, and a plant lady. In her free time, she is very creative, playing the harp, dabbling in art, and as of the last 18 months, learning a South Indian classical dance form. So, welcome, Rachana, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Tamba. I'm so excited to be here. And you forgot to mention I'm not just a cat lady, dog lady, and a plant lady. I'm a crazy cat lady, dog lady,
Crazy.
plant.
I apologize. I
Just,
forgot that one.
gotta keep it
Yeah.
honest, right?
So I think in the first instance, it would be very interesting and important for our viewers to kind of get to know you as a protagonist and as the focus of our interview. And it's very, very difficult, probably unrealistic, but could you give us the boiled down version of your biography, like the 90-second biopic?
The 90-second biop.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Let's get some biographical details out of the way, right? So,
Yeah.
I was born in Bombay, Mumbai. It was Bombay then.
Yeah.
Which is in Western India, but I'm ethnically, linguistically from South India,
Mhm.
and I speak the language Kannada as my native language. That's my mother tongue.
Yeah.
So I have roots in other parts of South India too, from my father's side.
Uh-huh.
I was raised in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, actually.
Yeah.
Lived there. We moved there when I was 4 years old, and I lived there till I was 18.
Mhm.
Then moved to the United States, to Illinois, to go to college at Knox College. And my second year at Knox is when I met you, Temba.
Yeah.
And that's how we know each other, our
Yeah.
paths crossed. And so I mean, I'm just want to take a moment to acknowledge how wonderful it is that a connection that we made 24 years ago is still an ongoing connection, and that
Yeah.
us as these young, barely out of our teenage years, kids who met, and now here we are, two middle-aged people having this
Yeah, I
conversation.
can't believe it. 20 years. Like,
It's been, yeah, it's been more than 20 years, and
yeah.
I just love that. I love the fact that we've had this sort of ongoing friendship and connection.
Yeah.
Is just beautiful for us to be able to kind of have a quarter of a century of history between us, which is,
Yeah.
it's lovely.
That's very nice of you to say. I haven't even thought about it this way. I was just thinking it's crazy that we have been in touch so long, even though we're usually separated by at least one ocean, and even though I almost lost your cat, which I've gracefully forgiven.
Was meant to happen.
Yeah. So okay, and how did you just very briefly, how did you end up at Iona College?
It's Iona University now,
Sorry,
but
Iona
it's
University.
okay. I don't want to get sued by my institution.
Yeah.
Um, so as you mentioned, I did my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, and
Mhm.
in with the anthropology department, but definitely with um, you know, a foot squarely in the religious studies department as well, because my area of research was Islam in South Asia, like
Yeah.
specifically Sufism and the politics of religious identity in South Asia. And so when I was looking for a job, the academic job market is tough, so you apply everywhere to anything
Yeah.
that you could possibly be connected to. And I was very, very lucky to have landed a position at Iona. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, just the idea that I live um, just 20 minutes away from the heart of New York City is for me just super exciting. Like every time I drive through the city, I think
Yeah.
I live in New York City. This is
Yeah.
amazing.
Super cool.
So that's how I ended up at Iona, and in the geographical region that I
Yeah.
am now is just the job market. It takes you where it takes you, and
Yeah, it
I feel
does.
very fortunate to have kind of landed on my feet where I did.
Yeah. So at the beginning, I like to ask people about their sources of inspiration in the broadest terms. It could be people, it could be novels, it could be works of art, it could be cultural practices. What kind of sources of inspiration have shaped you, do you think?
That is maybe one of the hardest questions for me to answer. I could answer that question for 2 hours.
Yeah,
Uh, I think maybe, as you were asking the question, I wasn't, anticipating this question. So as you were asking it, kind of,
mhm.
I had started to think, and the first thing that popped into my head was, um, for me, it's never ever been one thing.
Yeah,
It's never ever been a few things. I think since I was very, very little, I've been a bit of a sponge. Like my
yeah,
radar is always on, and I, without even realizing, I internalize or sort of learn things as have moved through life. And
yeah,
if you ask me, what is my source of inspiration, I think it's not one person or thing, but it is kind of this awareness that life is full of teachers. Like everyone you meet is a teacher. every
yeah,
every experience you have has the capacity to teach you. Every plant you encounter, every morning you
yeah,
wake up to teaches you something. And I think maybe that is my source of inspiration, is to to kind of think about the world, or think of the world around me as constantly offering something for me to learn. And um, to always kind of, like, a teacher is not a label, right? It's
yeah,
anyone can teach you something in just in the smallest interaction.
yeah,
And so I think maybe my inspiration is life, is the world, right? Just the roller coaster of everything that you encounter. And maybe that, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but
yeah, it is. That's very beautifully put. I think I feel very similar, but I could never express it as well. Um, so then there is this question um, that I'll just jump to, which is really at the heart of the interview, central to the interview. What is your understanding of racism, and what do you perceive as its causes and effects?
oh, okay. So let me just back up a little bit and say that, yeah, I'm a brown person. I'm a person of color, living in America. uh, and I grew up in the Middle East. But essentially, at the heart of it, my
Mm,
the culture, even in the United Arab Emirates, the culture in which I was raised was a South Asian culture, like an
yeah,
Indian culture, and an Indian Hindu culture as well. And in India, well, it's South Asia in general. This is not just an India thing. In South Asia in general, race is not race is not a defining characteristic.
yeah,
It is, um, that is the label of race is, I mean, that's not a category that exists in,
Yeah.
um, uh, it's not a category that animates the way in which people think about the world if you're
Hmm.
South Asian, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's for me, in a way, it was a new category, right?
Mhm.
Um, that is not to say that forms of racism do not exist in South Asian culture.
Yeah.
100% they do, but the language that we use to think about it is not racial language. It's not,
Mm.
race is not the category, right? So colorism is a huge thing
Yeah.
in South Asia, right? So and skin color isn't understood in terms of race
Hmm.
in South Asia. Um, a caste is a huge thing,
Yeah.
and caste is correlated, though not exactly, but is correlated with skin color in South Asia. But
Yeah.
again, race is not the word, race is not the category that is used to understand that, right? It's caste, it's skin color, right?
Mm.
And so my experience of racism for really, well, my experience of racism in the way in which it is understood in, say, Euro-American culture
Uh-huh.
was very remote,
Yeah.
mostly through watching European and American television programming growing up, right? The ways in which you see the contours of racial identity and the politics of race when you watch anything from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air
Mhm.
to some random soap opera, right? The Bold and the Beautiful, or whatever, some random soap opera, right?
Yeah.
And even an advertisement, right? Everything, like you see the contours of it
Yeah.
from afar and you have a sense of it, you get a sense of it,
Mhm.
but it wasn't something that I understood as a native to the concept, right?
Yeah.
It's not a native concept for me, right? And
Mhm.
I've had to, in a way, understand it as an outsider coming in when I arrived in America.
Yeah.
And even then, you live on this sort of sheltered college campus,
Yeah.
and then you move to a college town, a university town, and like, so I feel like in so many ways, even my experience of race in America has been mediated by the fact that I've lived in these very kind of, I've lived in bubbles
Yeah.
because I've always interacted with America from my position as a student, as an academic, as you know, these are, you know, and just the circles in which I move affects that.
Yeah.
Um, of course, you know, you encounter it much, like I've encountered it much, much more um, down south. You know, one of my partners, when I, you know, when I lived in North Carolina, was a woodworker, and you know, he had many friends who were, you know, blue collar, working class folk in North Carolina, and also relatives, right, who were
Mhm.
middle class and upper middle class white folk in South, you know, in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Um, so those were my first kind of real encounters of race in a, oh,
Mhm.
I wasn't expecting you to say that. You know,
Yeah.
that was my sort of really my first encounter. So they've been few and far between. But I think I don't want to keep rambling, but I think maybe a I'll answer your question, you know, in terms of the categories of hierarchy that I do understand as a native, and those
Yeah.
are in terms of color and caste.
Yeah.
Right? And it is saturated in South Asian culture. You cannot move around in South Asian culture without experiencing colorism. If you have never experienced colorism, it's probably because you're very fair skinned, and so
Yeah.
you've never encountered it. Um,
Uh-huh.
like I'm a relatively fair skinned South Asian, but I would be considered not fair enough
Yeah.
in South
Okay.
Asia. right? That
Yeah.
the ideals of standards of beauty and ideal standards of like what counts as refined, all of those are very much centered on um, extremely light skin color that
Mhm.
is not representative of 99% of the South Asian population. Like only a
Yeah.
fraction of South Asians, the faces you see in Indian movies,
Yeah.
right? They kind of represent the kind of the peak of the hierarchy of skin color, really. Um, and you encounter it all the time. And also caste, right? As I said, skin color and caste are correlated. um, but caste saturates South Asian culture, so people try to guess your caste on the basis of your facial features, on the basis of
Yeah.
your skin color. Um, the more Aryan, right, your features are, it's very explicit like that. Sort of very north. The more North Indian and Aryan your facial features are, the more you're coded as upper caste.
Mhm.
And the darker your skin color, the sort of less Europe, sort of North Indian, Aryan kind of facial features you have, the more you
Yeah.
get coded as of a lower caste. Um, your your last name is very, very indicative of your caste. So when you travel in India, it's very common, people will ask you your name and you give them your first name, and it'll always be followed up by, no, no, what is your full name? And
Uh-huh.
whether people realize it or not, it's a way of kind of, I need to know where to put you. I need to know
Ah,
what folder to
yeah.
put you in. And a last name can be very revealing of one's caste identity,
Mhm.
upper caste, lower caste. Um, so one of the reasons I don't use my middle name anymore, Temba, is because it
Ah,
is a caste specific. It's a caste specific name,
yeah.
and I I don't want, and it's a it I don't want someone to be able to just look at my name and be able to put me in a folder.
Yeah.
Whereas my last name is much more caste neutral. So
Okay.
I only go by my first and my last name. I don't go by my
Yeah.
middle name anymore. Um, so those are the ways in which I encounter it. And I have benefited from caste privilege my entire life.
Mm.
And it yeah, it saturates everything. Uh, but yeah, like I said, I could go on about it for ages.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm a bit conflicted now how I'm gonna phrase the next question because you gave us an idea of the form of discrimination as it exists in
Yeah.
South Asia and in your experience. And so the question was a bit about like what you understand to be the most urgent aspects of
Mm,
contemporary racism. Or
right.
but then I would rephrase it maybe what you see as the most pressing aspect of racism, colorism. Yeah.
Mm. Um, I mean, I feel like, again, as I said, it saturates everything,
Mm.
you know. It really, really saturates everything. And um I feel perhaps, right, that um and maybe like this is sort of, to use the language of solidarity, right?
Hmm.
Colorism, for example, right? Um, you're not going to move past colorism until it is no longer an advantage to be light skinned,
Yeah.
right? If As long as it's an advantage to be light skinned, those who are light skinned will benefit from that privilege, right? Whether they want to or not,
Yeah.
benefit from it. Um, and those who are not light skinned, right, will it it then becomes an impediment in so many ways to moving ahead in life,
Yeah.
right? If um kind of the first thing that a person sees is this is a dark skinned person,
Yeah.
right, it becomes sort of that becomes the first impression, that becomes the first thing you're putting forward. And so, for example, in India, right, one of the biggest selling cosmetics in India are skin lightening creams,
Yeah.
right? And skin lightening creams are fully embraced, right, by people who have dark skin.
Yeah.
And one can sit on, one's moral, throne and say, oh, you should love your dark skin, and black is beautiful and dark is
Yeah.
beautiful, and you don't have to be light skinned, and you're hating yourself by using fairness creams. Like you can say that, you know, um, but that's at some point a ridiculous thing to say to somebody whose skin color is putting them at such a serious disadvantage in the society that they live in, right? So
Yeah.
unless you're going to change the structural, dynamics of society at large, these kind of micro level pontifications are not going to serve anybody's purpose. And if anything, it puts darker skinned people in a bind, a double bind, right? Where uh, any attempt to where embracing their dark skin and not lightening up puts them
Mhm.
at a disadvantage, but then any attempt at lightening their skin uh, gets them a lecture from moral elites who say,
Yeah.
hey, you should love your dark skin, right? So there's no, it's a double bind, right?
Yeah.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. It's the same kind of situation with gender dynamics in South Asia, right? There's such a great preference for a male child in South Asia that South Asian society has one of the worst sex ratio, one of the most male skewed sex ratios in terms of
Yeah.
populations, because people, it's illegal, but people get an ultrasound and, determine the sex of the child. And then if it's a female child, they'll get an abortion. And if it's a male child, they'll keep it. This is very common practice, even though
Yeah.
it's illegal for physicians, for a technician to tell you the sex of a child
Yeah.
during ultrasound because of the skewed sex
Yeah.
ratio. It's illegal, but people still do it, right?
Yeah.
Female infanticide is common, still common in rural area, in impoverished communities. And it's all well and good to lecture people and say, oh, love your female child, and your the girl child is as important or as wonderful as the male, the boy child. Like, you get all of these public service messages everywhere. Nothing is going to change unless society doesn't disadvantage being the parent of a girl child, right?
Yeah.
In a society that deeply favors, puts men at an advantage over women, it's so ridiculous to lecture somebody for preferring a male child,
Yeah.
right? Change the freaking dynamics of the situation, right? Change the structure of it, then we can have a conversation. But of
Yeah.
course, these kind of structural changes are, they're seemingly
Exactly.
impossible, or at least, there are no quick fixes for it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't want to sound like a complete pessimist, because just in my lifetime, attitudes have changed, things have changed. My great grandmother had 10 children. I'm
Mm.
an only child and I'm a girl. I have so many cousins who are only children and girls, and it's
Yeah.
because our parents had us and said, this is enough.
Yeah.
We're not going to try to have a male child, right? So already there are shifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for any of these kind of big structural changes to happen, it's like, it's like turning a giant ship around. It's not, it takes time.
Yeah,
It's generational work. It's
yeah,
not going to be something that any one person is able to kind of fix in their lifetime. It's like we all kind of chip in, we all try to, you know, it's tiny fractions of, little shift here, little shift there, and hopefully decades from now, those tiny little shifts will start, bearing fruit. Sorry for that mixed metaphor. But anyway, that I feel is that maybe, so to again answer your question, I ramble a lot, but to answer your question, I think the most pressing issue um is I think keeping both of those things squarely in view, right?
mm-hmm.
The idea that major structural shifts need to take place for us to be able to live in an equitable world.
Yeah,
Um, but also at the same time acknowledging that we each of us as individuals do not have the capacity to enact those major structural shifts,
yeah,
right? All we have is this much control
yeah,
over certain things, but we have agency within those constraints, and not allowing the fact that each of us individually cannot enact those shifts, not allowing that reality of
mm-hmm.
powerlessness to a certain extent to prevent us from exerting power in the ways that we are able to exert power, right? Like
Yeah,
both of those need to be held at the same time. Kind of realizing that yes, these major shifts need to happen. I'm powerless to enact those major shifts,
mm,
but within the realm in which I do operate, perhaps there are ways in which I can use my agency, I can use my privilege, I can use my voice, I can use my power of resistance to enact certain forms of change, with the hope that that is not pointless, right? That
yeah,
has reverberations, that has the capacity to at some point make major shifts, right? Like we have to be able to hold both that powerlessness and the sense of power we do, the agency we do have. We kind of need to hold both of those things together. I think
yeah.
that is maybe for me the most pressing concern is how do we do that, right? How do we
How do
be
we
sane through.
cultivate that mindset
Yeah.
where, yeah, where our personal biography doesn't seem pointless in the face of history? But yeah, I agree very much. Um, then actually the next one, I try to balance it. So to say racism, sexism, discrimination is on the negative side and some concepts on the positive side.
Yeah.
One would be diversity. What is your idea? What is your definition of diversity? And what do you consider it's like flowery, positive upsides, and where do you see that it can be an issue?
Okay, since we've been talking about kind of the negative stuff, so let me answer your second question first and then
Yeah.
transition to sort of a more positive thing. I think the more maybe negative aspects of um, the way in which the whole sort of diversity language initiatives have played out over the past couple of decades, I think is in that I think many of us, with the best of intentions,
Mhm.
right, have hoped to enact those major structural changes um, through what have through initiatives that, while not meaningless, are have only a limited capacity, right? That they are at best band-aids, right?
Yeah.
And and those major structural changes, and frustration, I think, for a lot of us who want a more equitable world, that these, legislations, these policy initiatives, all of these things haven't had the as much of an impact as we've hoped. And
Mm.
if anything, I mean, our election is, an indication, right, that
Mm.
there is either a backlash against those kinds of structural, policy initiatives, or it has become part of the noise in the background, and so
Yeah.
people are just able to tune it out, right?
Yeah.
Just another box that I have to check, just another hoop I have to jump through, just another thing that the bureaucracy is making me do, right?
Mm.
um so uh and I think, and this will sort of get me to the positive, right? I think the biggest issue with that, and I think the reason why that is because there is at a fundamental level a disjuncture, a dissonance,
Mm.
right? Because at a basic level, these forms of discrimination, these um, things that prevent us from living in an equitable world, right?
Mm.
That these are enacted at a micro level,
Yeah.
right? We all enact them, right? What, even if we don't want to be, I mean, that's what sort of unconscious bias, right, we talk about, right? Even if we don't want to be racist or sexist or, classist or
Yeah.
colorist or whatever ist you want, right? Even if we don't consciously want to do that, because we are saturated in those systems, it's so much our default setting, and it requires active work within us, within our psyche, to kind of move out of the ways in which we've internalized those
Mm.
realities, right, as truths. And how is a policy going to do that, right?
Yeah.
You can get people to take as many anti-discrimination courses you want them to take, right? You can have people sit through as many, anti-bias seminars that you
Yeah.
want them to sit through. And at some point, the marginal utility curve for that drops, right? That, okay, maybe like the first few minutes or something, you have somebody's attention, but then, you know, at some point, it stops being useful. It stops, if anything, it generates distaste, right?
Yeah.
Um, so those kinds of policy fixes, those kinds of administrative and bureaucratic solutions to these deep-seated problems can, I'm not
Yeah.
saying they're useless. I'm saying that they're useful only to a certain extent. And I
Yeah.
think perhaps I think something that a lot of, you know, folks left of no folks center and left of center make,
Mm.
right, is to presume that these bureaucratic fixes will be the panacea needed, right, to solve these problems, and we feel extreme frustration when they don't, right?
Yeah.
um and I think, you know, there there are structural changes that can be made, but so much of the work that has to happen at kind of a virtue ethics kind level, right?
Yeah.
That a lot of that, for us to live in an equitable world, it requires us to do a lot of introspection and reflection, about the world we live in, and how we think of ourselves and our relationships to other people.
Yeah.
um, this is not bureaucratic work. This is spiritual work.
Yeah.
how are you going to enact a policy for spiritual work? A, you can't do that. B,
Mm.
you shouldn't even try to do that, because then, I mean, what's the difference between that and like a re-education camp?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking, I agree partially because I see the spiritual aspect of it, but I sometimes also think of it in terms of consciousness and at what level is the consciousness of people trained? Because you were talking about the workshops, and I also think the usefulness of those workshops is extremely limited, but I do think that if it's more systematically a part of education across the grades, starting from primary school and then up, and not just like, oh, you are now in high school, second to last year of high school, third to last year of high school. Now we're going to do some ethics classes and that's it. But I feel that if there's more of these awareness and consciousness and ethics classes starting from an early age that go together with real practice, like meeting actually people in everyday life, then maybe there's a chance that there will be
Sure.
more change.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's the same with, we both are teachers, so
Yeah.
we have a sense of this. We teach our classes, and I get a sense that you enjoy teaching as well,
Mhm.
and we enjoy interacting with our students, and all of these things. We kind of put our heart and soul into it. Um, but we know this to be true, that you know our students are learning, for example, our students are learning mathematics since they were in kindergarten. They're
Yeah.
learning numbers, they're learning mathematics since they're in kindergarten. How many of our students actually internalize these concepts?
Yeah.
Right? Like, they know how to do math, right? They know how to add, how to multiply, how to subtract, how to divide,
Mhm.
right? Maybe they can plot a graph, sorry, they can plot a graph, right?
Yeah.
um, but how many people internalize mathematical concepts
Yeah.
in the way they think about the world? Right, very few, right? So there's a gap between instruction you can give, right? You
Yeah.
can give all the instruction you want to give, but there's a fuzzy human element and ineffable, intangible element to the process of teaching and learning
Mm.
that no amount of training in that bureaucratic sense can get to, right?
Yeah.
Because it's about synergy, it's about openness and
Mm.
ability to internalize what someone is saying to you, and the ability to be able to communicate in a way that another person is able to understand, right? Like, there's no one, I guess that's what I'm saying, is there's that a lot of these policy changes, and even the model of a school of schooling, as
Yeah.
you say, like an ethics class, right? That these are by their nature a one size fits all mode of delivery.
Yeah.
It's not useless. I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These are important things. Um, but it cannot be 100% of the solution.
Yeah.
And I feel perhaps one of the things that is coming home to roost for a lot of folks left, center and left of center, is that for so long, especially for the left, right, there has been this tendency to ignore that warm fuzzy human aspect of it.
Yeah.
So much of the focus is on structure, on structural changes. It's a very kind of Marxist, and I'm saying Marxists out there, don't hate on me. I enjoy Karl Marx, right? I'm a fan. Um, but there are limitations to that kind of structural thinking,
Mm.
right? And even Marx would, I think, agree with me. Like, if you read Marx, whether you know, he was conscious of it or not, he's deeply moral.
Yeah.
He's he thinks about the proletariat not as a mass, but also as human individuals who have an internal life that needs space and time and energy
Yeah.
to express, right? But I think that that kind of warm, fuzzy aspect of of leftist thinking, has been, it hasn't been nurtured, right? It has been like, oh, that kind of warm, fuzzy stuff that's not, we don't deal with that.
Yeah.
We're all about the structure and the policy and the bureaucracy, right? That's what the left is comfortable with. And I think that has been a major uh, weakness of liberals, of the left, whatever, because that has meant that the language of morality, the language of ethics, the language of the humanness, the humanity of us has been almost given over. We have conceded that ground to the right.
Yeah. Yeah, because they are more versed at appealing to that aspect of human nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, it is a blunder, because there is something deeply ethical and deeply moral about wanting to live in an equitable world, right? There is something deeply moral about wanting to live in a world where a person is treated justly and fairly,
Yeah.
right? With dignity. And to a great extent, that kind of, even the language I'm using, this kind of language is absent in the
Mm.
ways in which, for the longest time, the left has articulated its agenda,
Yeah.
and um, it's you see people, like, for example, Reverend Barber's work in, the Moral Mondays movement in the United States. You see it sort of creeping back in those ways. You see it in the works of Gandhi. You see it in the works of King. You see it in Mandela's, writings. Um, but I feel like still the left is very uncomfortable. It's not language that the left is comfortable with.
Yeah.
And I feel the sooner that the left starts learning to be warm and fuzzy,
Yeah.
and to speak to that sort of unstructural, non-structural, non-bureaucratic core of humanness, the better we will be able to realize that world that all of us want to live in, you know?
Mm.
So,
And actually, my next question plugs right into this. I was mentioning, so we had racism, diversity, and then also the third one, agency. So the question is, what would you call agency? And you've already, to quite a degree, answered this, but I'm going to put it straightforward. What would you call agency, and what have been your earliest experiences of actually having this agency?
huh, the second question, that's gonna be a hard one to answer.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of like how I think of agency, um, I think I'm like deeply inspired by um, there are two things I think I can point to, right? I think I take a lot of lessons from a Taoist perspective. Um, and there's also sort of one line from the Bhagavad Gita that really kind of addresses that idea of agency. Um, the Let me start with the Bhagavad Gita, because it's really just one line that kind of is etched into my psyche in some ways, and it's in Sanskrit, that it's karmanye vadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. Right? That's in Sanskrit, and what it
Mm.
means is that um, it says you have a right only
Yeah.
to your actions. You do not have a right to the fruit of your actions.
Mm.
Right? So you're only entitled to do what you have the capacity and the duty to do.
Yeah.
You're not entitled to the rewards that you seek for your actions, right? Because when you act, it's like you throw stuff in the air. You don't know where things are going to fall, right? Like that sort of butterfly effect thing. You
Yeah.
don't know, right? So if you're always attuning your actions based on what you think will get you to that end result,
Hmm.
the quickest, right? Or in the most direct way, that's a recipe for disappointment.
Yeah.
Whereas if you try and attune your actions to the on the basis of, okay, this is where I stand, these are the things that I have agency over,
Hmm.
right? And really at the end of the day, you have only agency over things that you can do and say. You cannot control other people. You can try to manipulate and control other people, but there's a limit to even that, right?
Yeah.
So you only have, this is your agency to be very, very aware of what your capacities are. Um, and in that moment when you have the capacity to act, and we act in every moment, we act, right? Your question to me, how I choose to answer the question, all of these things, right? We
Mm.
make decisions on how to act every moment. I guess what the Bhagavad Gita there is trying to say is just look to the present, that moment where you are, and
Yeah.
how can you act in that moment that is in alignment with your values, with your sense of your duty, your sense of your responsibilities,
Yeah.
and act on the basis of that, rather than constantly trying to look ahead to the unknown, because you have no control over that, and then you feel despondent and defeated and powerless, right? So that for me, like, it's not easy. I don't think I succeed all the time. Most
Yeah.
of the time I don't succeed, but in moments of great frustration, I think I try and remind myself that, yeah, I'm not entitled to that, right? I'm not entitled to those consequences that I want, those rewards of a just world. I'm not at an individual level. I'm not entitled to that in any way. The universe doesn't owe me jack shit, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not entitled to that. But I have the capacity to act. Everyone has agency.
Yeah.
Some people's agency is very constrained because of the circumstances that life has put them in. Other people
Mhm.
have a great deal of agency,
Yeah.
right? So if we are aware of the agency that we do have, how can we act from that point, right? Of saying, okay, this is what I can do, this is what I must do, and
Yeah.
so I will do this, right? And it requires a lot of discipline, and I'm no ascetic, so I can't say I've achieved that level of enlightenment, but it certainly guides me in my moments of deep frustration.
Mm.
um, and the other thing sort of is, the kind of the core idea of a Taoist worldview is, again, not super different from what the Bhagavad Gita is saying in that line, right? Which is that, um, the Tao Te Ching is a very cryptic text,
Mm.
but the essence of it is that if you're constantly struggling towards the goal that you want,
Mm.
your chances of achieving that goal diminish. Like a swimmer trying to swim upstream,
Yeah.
you're struggling so hard and expending so much energy, and the current is just pushing you back, right?
Yeah.
And so the Tao Te Ching suggests that a better way, um, for human beings, again, with our limited capacities, our
Yeah.
limited agency, a better way perhaps is to think in terms of alignment,
Hmm.
right? With sort of, I don't know, not to get too much into the weeds of the Tao Te Ching, but in alignment with a more harmonious sense of existence, right? And acting from that position of harmony, right? And not in a macro sense, not focusing on the goal, but again, in that moment, how can I act that is not a struggle, but that is in harmony with, you know, all of the currents that are coming my way? And that kind of harmonious, that way of acting and being that focuses on harmony rather than a race to reach a goal,
Yeah.
right? That allows us to act in ways that are deeply powerful for ourselves and for those around us and for the world, right?
Mm.
And again, how much I actually am able to do this depends on the day, right? Some days I struggle a lot, some days I don't. But I try and kind of remind myself of those things, right? That
Mm.
okay, if the goal is seems frustratingly far away and unreachable, and I feel like I don't have the capacity to reach it,
Yeah.
um, nobody is getting anything out of that, including me or the world.
Yeah.
So again, kind of focusing on the agency that we do have,
Hmm.
right? And again, being aware of its contours, very clearly aware of the contours of our agency, and then deep acting deep from a place of, that kind of what what is the world I want to live in? Let me create that world in that little sphere of agency that I have,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, it's yeah, so totally you don't totally abandon objectives, but you act within these
Yes.
limits and within
I
these
have
reasons.
I have the like if I want to live in a just world, an equitable world,
Mhm.
it is within my power to create that world in a micro level
Yeah.
every moment that I act. I have that is within my power, right? It is
Do you,
within my power in and it could be the smallest like a decision, like to not exert your privilege in a way that you might make things easier for you.
yeah.
Small things, like tiny decisions like that, right? We have the capacity to do that,
Mhm.
right? So why not? Why
Yeah.
not do that, right? Within those spheres of agency that we have, why not create a microcosm of the universe that we want to live in those moments of agency, those spheres of agency?
Yeah. As the anarchists call it, the temporary autonomous zone.
Oh, is that what the anarchists call it? A temporary
Yeah, yeah, where you create this cosmos of the future in the present. I was just reminded of this when you said it.
I had no idea that there was actually a phrase for this. I'm gonna
I
look that
hadn't thought of this in
up.
years, but it sounded like it.
Oh yeah, I guess that sounds about, yeah, that sounds right.
And for you, do you kind of recall maybe your first bloomings, blossomings, flowerings of a sense of agency?
Oh yeah, that was the hard question. Yeah, I think so. Uh, I I grew up, my sort of personal family life wasn't a very harmonious one growing up. There was a lot of domestic tension at home, to say the least.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm an only child. And so I think from a very early on, I from very early on, I think I probably was very aware of kind of a bubbles of those autonomous zones, I guess, right? Because as a child, you have no control over, your parents arguing or fighting. You don't have control. That you don't have much agency as a child,
Yeah.
you know. You're dependent on other individuals for your survival.
Hmm.
And you're also called to act in ways that maybe don't sit well with you, or are a struggle for you, and yet you
Yeah.
have to do it because a grown up told you you have to do it.
Exactly.
So childhood is, it can feel it like a deeply um, a space with very little agency.
Mm.
But I think I was able to, through all that kind of domestic disharmony and struggle and strife, I think that my survival mechanism, my coping mechanism, I think was kind of to be to find those islands of peace,
Mm.
right? To find those spaces where um, I could just be, um, and flourish, right?
Yeah.
In those zones, right? Um, so I think, and I hadn't thought about this till you asked me the question.
Yeah.
So thank you. But I think
Welcome.
when I reflect back, I definitely get a sense that that's how I survived. That's how I survived, as a kind of a with my sanity mostly intact. I think, is because maybe I was able to, again, as an only child, I that is something I could do, that I was able to have those spaces of solitude where I
Yeah.
could um, nurture a sense of self and kind of find agency in those spaces. Mhm.
And how is your agency these days?
I mean, I'm living the life, man.
Yeah.
I most days I wake up thinking, dang, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but this is amazing.
Yeah.
I I feel very, very grateful to whatever timeline, whatever simulation, whatever reverberation of the universe, there, whatever chaos that,
Mm.
I don't know how long it'll last, but um I feel good.
Yeah.
I feel like, um all things considered, I have been dealt a good hand. And I feel a great deal of agency and autonomy,
Mm.
you know, um most days, um most moments. And yeah, I mean, I'm I'm very, very glad for it. I'm very grateful for it. Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that. Um, So let's check. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. So in this second half, I would like to try to just link it a bit back to your field of expertise in the limited way that I understand it. And you're an Islam scholar.
Mhm.
So viewed from the perch of your expertise and experience, how does Islam deal with or address issues of discrimination?
Mm,
And what is important there?
yeah. Um, yeah. So yeah, definitely, when we think about, what are the with any religion, right? What are the animating questions in that religion? What is, you know, uh, what are the focal points? If you look at the sacred texts, right? If you look at the foundational teachings of the texts, and
No.
of, um, the founding figures of any, religious movement, um, what is it that seems to be kind of a driving theme through it all? um, and looking at, looking at the Quran, looking at the Sunnah, which is the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the a driving theme throughout is definitely this kind of focus um, on justice
Yeah.
in the face of tyranny, right? Resisting oppression. Um, you know, ideas. The Quran is replete with ideas like, uh, you know, uh, the wealth of the rich will not purchase a place in the afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you have verses of the Quran that say things like, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not
Yeah,
quoting
yeah.
from the Quran, right? There are verses in the Quran that say things like, there's, you know, that deride, that criticize people who pray, like make a show of praying,
Yeah.
but don't show common decency in their everyday lives, right? So things like that, right? That the Quran and the Sunnah are full of things about how, those of us who occupy positions of privilege and power, right,
Mm-hmm.
must use those positions of privilege and power to raise up those without privilege and power, right? These are themes that you find, like, it's not one or two verses. The Quran is full of verses that focus on these things, right?
Yeah.
And of course, in the centuries, the 1,400 years since, the beginnings of Islam, various legal and structural interpretations of the Quran have, focused on other aspects of the Quran, the more legal and structural aspects of the Quran,
Mm-hmm.
which, again, these are historical contingencies of the, again, I could lecture for an hour about this, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to, right? But if you go to the heart, right? If you go to the verses of the Quran, if you go to the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, right? Um, and you do a tally, like a ledger, right? You do a tally of what themes get repeated most, what themes are found throughout the Quran, then those legalistic structural aspects of Islam that become so focused on, those are fewer.
Mm-hmm.
And what really kind of pops up with the greatest frequency and at the most human level, not at a structural legalistic level, but at the most human level, the things that, the ledger is very much weighted in favor of the aspects, the ideas that I just talked about, right? Of resisting oppression, of using one's privilege and power, for the betterment of society, of sort of not thinking of our value in terms of wealth, right? These are the animating themes that you really kind of find weight in the Quran. um and so, you know so for me, like, and again, my focus, my area of research specialization is Sufism.
Yeah.
And a very core theme of Sufism is the idea of intent.
Mm-hmm.
That one's actions, whatever one does, that the mirror, we must always have our intent
Mm-hmm.
clearly in focus, right? That there must always be a mirror through which we are able to check our intent, right?
Yeah.
Whatever we do. And that so much resonates with this idea of agency, right? Like, what are you using your we all have a little bit of power. What are you using your power for?
Yeah.
Right? Are you using your power to enrich yourself? Are you using your power to further increase your power? Are you using your power to kind of rebalance an inequitable world, right?
mm,
And also this idea of intent, right? Like how do I know what to do, right? Maybe you take a moment to reflect on your intent, right? What is the core, the root of my desire here, right? Is do I want to do this thing, you know, because, you know, my is my intent coming from a place of of equity and justice, or is my intent reflecting something that is less in alignment with the world that I want to see around me, right? So I don't think that there is any dearth of, you know, these ideas and concepts within the Islamic tradition broadly, or
yeah.
even more specifically in terms of Sufism, right? You see it, you see it everywhere. Mhm.
Okay. Thank you very much for this elucidation. And I was also considering another area of your expertise, which I believe I don't know how to phrase this properly, but you're quite conversant, let's say, with Bollywood movies. And I was thinking, how do they deal with and how do they deal with and portray discrimination, say racism and sexism? I think it's particularly interesting because I think of it in my from my very limited perspective as um, movies made by brown people for brown people, but it's of course in a completely different cultural sphere. So yeah, Bollywood, how does it deal with, how does it portray racism, sexism? How do you see this?
Uh, uh,
Sorry, these are
it's a
all
huge,
book length
it's a
topics.
huge question.
Yeah.
I think in many ways, the art we make um, reflects the society, the values of the society we live in. You know, especially when we think about um, yeah, you know, so Bollywood, or any, you know, Bollywood is just the mainstream um Hindi Urdu language movie industry.
Yeah.
There are other language movie industries in India.
Yeah.
India is home to multiple mutually unintelligible languages, so there are huge mainstream, you know, film studios and movie makers and big budget productions that come out of various South Indian language traditions. Some of the biggest Indian movies of the past few years have actually not been Bollywood. They have
Yeah.
been from other, you know, language industries in India. Um, but in general, films, mainstream films, I'm not talking about like art house films or, you know, indie films where you have artists who are sort of thinking in critical terms, or, you know, thinking about their own sort of personal artistic expression. Those are very diverse, right? And they're amazing. But if we think about the big budget studio films, right? That most people who don't know anything about India, those are the kinds of movies that they're exposed to. Those big
Mm,
budget mainstream films, they replicate all of those hierarchies in the films, right?
mm,
These films are not made to challenge the status quo. They're films that are meant to provide an escapist form of entertainment within the structural framework that exists,
mm,
right? So colorism is replete, you know, it um, like I said, you know, like I would be considered too dark for a you know,
mm.
a spot in a movie,
Yeah.
right? Right? So this crazy standards of light skin.
Yeah.
Um, you know, most Indian movie stars look nothing like the average Indian.
Mm,
Like in racial terms, they're different races. Very similar to how you watch a Mexican soap opera and everyone in the soap opera is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, light-skinned,
mm,
Caucasian appearance. Your average person in Mexico doesn't look like that, right?
yeah.
It's very similar. Um, uh, Gender tropes have begun to change a bit,
Mm,
like in the past 20 years.
mm,
You certainly see some shifts. Um, but fundamentally the hierarchies have not changed.
mm,
Um, uh, Same in terms of caste, right? Caste is rarely directly addressed head on. I'm not
yeah.
saying never, but rarely directly addressed head on in films. But protagonists are almost always um, uh, their caste identity is almost always an upper caste identity,
Yeah.
right? If you look at the names that are given to characters in films, um, they're almost always upper caste Hindu, uh,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, these things are replicated in the films. They you don't really see that hierarchy budging
Yeah.
in films. Yeah.
Okay. And another very straightforward relation to your experience, expertise, field of work. You are um, woman of Indian background working on the east coast of the USA. So the question is, and you alluded to this a bit in the beginning, and my question is, what have been your encounters and confrontations with different forms of discrimination?
At a personal level, I have to say I've been very lucky, right? Again, because of where I live and um, also because I'm an academic, right?
Mm,
That like we went to a small college, in
yeah,
Illinois, and our campus was nothing like um, you know the surrounding
mm,
areas, right, in terms of culture, right?
yeah,
Our campus was very progressive, very left wing. Um, uh, but at the same time, I think also, um, right, I'll come back to that, right? But same, when I went to university at UNC Chapel Hill,
mm,
Chapel Hill, it's a university town, very liberal, very progressive. People are coming there from the Research Triangle Park is like this tech
yeah,
hub. There are people coming from all over the world. So, very diverse part of the South. Um, so, I think in so many ways I've been sheltered because of that.
yeah,
And also personality wise, I sometimes like, again, what I mentioned when I was talking about my childhood,
yeah,
I have a way of kind of just tuning stuff out. I kind of live in a little fantasy world in my head, I think, like like it's always cosplay for me.
mm,
I
yeah,
think, like I got this Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings world I live in my head, or like I'm on the Star Trek bridge or something like that. Like
I love it.
all the world's a stage, right? Like I
Um,
think I personality wise also I have a capacity to kind of just tune out nonsense.
uh,
And so I'm not always attuned to some of these things at a personal level because of my circumstances, because of personality. Um, but also, I will say, right, as a an highly educated person
mhm,
who speaks English fluently, I have an accent
Yeah.
but it's not one of those like, like I don't sound, it is very much a coded as an upper class posh accent,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not a British accent, but it is the upper kind of a English educated, uh, English speaking households kind of accent, that is you find in India, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in America, it gets coded as British. It gets
Yeah.
coded as posh, right? So I'm highly educated. I have an accent that people seem to like, right?
Mm.
As opposed to, for example, a character like Apu,
Yeah.
right, in The Simpsons, uh, who's who very much gets coded as someone who's comical, right? And his
Mm-hmm.
accent plays into the comedy of the way in which he's presented, right? So
Yeah.
so my accent doesn't fit into that folder. Um, um, I'm also light skinned, right?
Mm.
Um, and uh, I I come with I come without the baggage of generational trauma because I come from an upper caste family.
Yeah.
There are chips on my shoulder that I walk around with, but
Mm.
there are also huge privileges that I've completely taken for granted that are completely invisible to me
Yeah.
because I am coded when I go to India, when I interact with Indians, I am coded as an upper caste woman.
Yeah.
Right, and I have just sailed through situations because as soon as I walk into the room, people recognize me as someone who is not a lower caste person, right?
Mm.
I don't even I I don't even know what price tag to put on that kind of privilege. um and so I think when I, just going back to our experience on a college campus, right, I think that I was able to fit in so well into that progressive small liberal arts, space
Yeah.
because I was able to speak that language fluently, right? It is a language, it is an extremely rarefied and privileged atmosphere that both of us walked into,
Yeah.
that liberal arts college in America. um, in no way reflecting the reality of most of America, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like because of all of those privileges, caste privilege, skin color, education, upbringing, my parents had a very, whatever their failings, they had a very cosmopolitan outlook, which I internalized. So that kind of cosmopolitan outlook, right? Uh, the kind of secular worldview, the all of these things, right? I
Mm.
think protect me in
Yeah.
so many ways from feeling the brunt of American racism, right?
Yeah.
I have lived in America for 25 years now, 24 years now,
Yeah.
and there are only like I've experienced that kind of racism at a very few instances of it. And that
Yeah.
is not to say that it doesn't exist, but it's because I think all of these things that I've talked about, right, have given me a certain, have shielded me
Yeah.
from it. I think my life would be very different in America had I been a bearded brown man,
Yeah.
right? I think my life would have been very different in America had I been much darker skinned.
Mm.
Right? I think my life would have been very different in America had I not been fluent in English.
Yeah.
Forget fluent in English. My life would be very difficult, would have been very different if I wasn't able to speak in a kind of a culturally sophisticated register of English.
Yeah.
Um, uh, my life would have been very, very different if my accent were different. My life would have been very different if I were a Dalit, right? If I like, we have so many instances in the United States of Dalits, right, from India experiencing caste discrimination from
Mm.
fellow Indians in the United States.
Yeah.
I've never experienced that,
Mm.
right? So I feel like um, the privileges that the privileges that were mine just because of the circumstances of my birth have continued to protect me, right? Have continued to shield me um, in the United States too.
Yeah, I was just thinking this description of yours, to quite an extent. I've had similar experiences, especially in the US. Maybe a bit less because depending on my hair and such, it can vary.
Yeah.
But I was thinking it's also interesting because as much as racism is systemic, it can also sometimes be very circumstantial, like certain circumstances, like in your case, can conspire to block it out a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, and not just block it out. I think in many ways too, right? The constellation of privileges that I come with, I
Hmm.
think also allow me to be placed by mainstream American society
Yeah.
as kind of a kind of a the sort of token model minority kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like um to put it very bluntly, white people find it easy to interact with me.
Yeah.
You know, it they don't feel threatened by my very existence because in so many ways I bring with me a similar privilege, right?
Yeah.
A similar identity privilege. I educated white people, right? Uh, or white people of a middle class, right? Upper middle class, upper class are able to recognize a fellow privileged person in me,
Yeah.
right? That we are two elites. And I use the word elite here in a very broad sense. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about like the 1%. I'm saying we're elite in that we don't, right? That there are certain default setting privileges that are given to us, whether we want it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, right? That's what I mean, right? So it's when white people of middle class and above or a certain education level and above interact with me, they see a kindred spirit in that sense,
Yeah.
right? They see someone that they can associate with.
Yeah.
I don't
Exactly.
make them feel uncomfortable,
Yeah. Mm.
right? And again, it's not something I'm trying to do
Mm.
necessarily. I can't help it. Right?
Yeah, it's just
It's just is it comes
part
with
of
the
the,
territory in a way,
yeah,
right?
the circumstances
The
that can.
circumstances. And so I think that those, right, if we're talking about discrimination, racism,
Mm.
right, I feel like those, that the privileges that exist among certain classes and categories of people in one part of the world do have the capacity to translate in other parts of the world,
Yeah.
right? Recognize you're able to interact like um why does the king of Saudi Arabia and Trump get along so well,
Yeah, exactly.
right? They understand each other's language. They know this. They recognize this as a shared universe.
Mm.
Doesn't matter if one person is from another culture, another the person is from a different culture.
Mm.
There is a language they have in common, right?
Mm.
The language of privilege is sort of cuts across boundaries in many ways.
Mm,
Um, yeah. So I feel like there's my experience, yeah, my experience of America has been a very charmed uh, experience in so many ways. Uh, because of this, I think, sort of capacity to, um, because of the way in which privilege can translate.
mm. Okay, wow. That was very elaborately put. I was just thinking, no, it's because I've been thinking about some similar issues a long time, but couldn't put it so well and conceptualize it so
So
well. Now we come to our second to last segment. It's called non-trigger trigger, and it's trigger because it's supposed to get you thinking, and non-trigger because I hope it's not traumatic in any way. And yeah, let's try this. Academia.
Oh, bullshit.
Perfect start. New York.
Oh, a universe within a universe.
Nice. Black Lives Matter.
Yes, they do.
The harp.
Oh, something I wish I played more. Haven't My harp has become dusty. My strings are dusty. I need to undust them. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
The Midwest.
Marshmallow salad.
Marshmallow salad.
Yes, that's the
That
first
sounds
thing that came to mind.
absolutely horrendous. Okay, I'll have to try it though. Sufi poetry.
Oh, layers and layers and layers of meaning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then the year 2028.
2028. No idea.
Okay.
No
Look,
idea. I
yeah,
can't even begin to imagine.
I just had I have certain hopes associated with it, but we'll see.
But the blankness is a response too, right?
Yeah. And then the saying, le club, c'est moi.
You're reminding me of my dictatorial and completely despotic rule of the anthropology department when I was an undergrad.
Uh,
Yes, I I used to be the president of and mostly the sole member of the anthropology club, and
uh,
yeah, it was great. I did pretty much whatever I wanted.
Nobody challenged your rule.
Nobody did. No,
Yeah,
I had a small discretionary budget, and I just did whatever I want, hosted
uh,
any event that I wanted, and they were good. Come on, they were. I feel
yeah.
like I was a good despot.
I have to agree. I have to agree. Then the final one is black, brown, yellow, white.
Mm, um, just just some colors on our visible spectrum.
Mm. Okay. Thank you very much. That's it for the non-trigger triggers. There's still a very, very, very last segment.
Yes, tell
That
me.
is like kind of recommendations. Well, recommendations and experiences. So the first one is like one or two or three practices in your own life that have had a positive impact.
Yeah, I think some of them I've mentioned already, right? That kind of practice of reminding yourself of both the limitedness and the expansiveness of your agency,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah, definitely helps me uh, not feel hopeless,
Hmm.
and definitely gives me the wind in, it's a wind in my sails, right? Because it allows me to kind of remind myself that I do have the capacity to act, and though it may be limited, it is a capacity, that I can put into, into force. So that, for sure. Another huge practice for me is to always like lean into the light.
mm,
Um, and to always focus on the joy and the beauty that there is in the world,
yeah,
um, and not as a form of self-indulgence,
yeah,
not in the kind of hashtag self-care kind of
yeah,
way, but kind of our capacity to give requires our well springs to be full.
yeah,
And when we kind of focus on love and we focus on joy and we focus on the things that are beautiful in the world, it refuels us, it charges us, right? It reminds us of the things that are worth fighting for, and also acts uh, as a thing that gives us energy
yeah.
and spirit. And so, very much something that is deeply important to me is to crawl out of the hole and kind of focus on that, on the light, whatever that light is. Just
Mm.
talking to you is light, bringing so much joy to me.
I mean,
Stuff like that.
yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Then what are some total pan-global no-nos?
Like what? Like
Absolutely.
never something you never do.
Yeah, you think this is no, this should absolutely not be done.
Um, yeah, I think you know the the sort of human tendency sometimes to feel better about ourselves by putting others down,
Hmm.
right? That uh, the oppressed can become oppressors, right? The that we um, when we feel powerless, uh, we can we can begin to feel powerful by exerting the limited power we have over
Yeah.
those with less power than us. Um, no, don't do that. Let's not do that,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
antithetical to the idea of solidarity, and it's antithetical to the idea of dignity,
Mm.
ours and others. Um, so yeah, let's not play the oppression Olympics here.
Mm.
Let's not do that. Yeah. Mhm.
Then recommendations could be novels, could be movies, could be museums, like just a few, maybe, one, two, three, which lately, yeah,
Mm.
or not even lately, could also be some lifetime hits, yeah, some
Yeah, I
stuff.
mean, I've mentioned the Tao Te Ching, again, for anyone new to it, it is extremely opaque, can be extremely opaque.
Mm.
But if you can read about Taoist ideas as a background and then delve into the text and keep sort of going back to the text, it certainly has the capacity to liberate,
Mm.
and also allow us to realize our agency.
Yeah.
So the Tao Te Ching for sure. Uh, the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Mm.
eternal favorite for me. I've taught some version of it, excerpts from it, for years now, and I always learn something from it when I teach it. Um,
Yeah.
and I am partial to the Benjamin Foster translation,
Mm.
of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Love it. Um, and also I feel like getting away from the tyranny of the written word
Yeah.
is also important, right? That I feel like um, we get really caught up in our intellect, um, and we forget sometimes that our intellectual worlds are not necessarily the world, right?
Yeah.
And so making space for experiences, there are rich cultures throughout human history who never felt the need to read and write,
Hmm.
right? Rich traditions in the world that, you know, never had a script,
Yeah.
right? And it is the kind of a global north um, perspective, right? Kind of the global north stretching back to ancient Mesopotamia,
Yeah.
right? That has privileged cultures with the written world as civilized and cultures without writing as uncivilized.
Mm.
Um, and what we, I mean, aside from the inherent oppressiveness of that perspective, what we lose in that process is all of the ways in which human beings experience the world that is unmediated by the written word.
Yeah.
Forms of knowing, forms of understanding the world that if are either not found in the written word or
Mm.
are in some ways obstructed by the written word,
Yeah.
right? So finding ways to relearn and re-experience the world without the text,
Mm.
right? Without words, perhaps even. Um, that I yeah, certainly something that uh, I feel many of us who live in our heads don't allow ourselves to do. So yeah. Mhm.
Thank you very much, Rachana. This has been, I don't have the adjectives for it really. It's just going to reduce what has been this experience. And
Thank you.
so I'm very grateful and already now a bit excited to go back and listen to it again, to all the beautiful stuff you have said. And yeah, so this episode 11 with Rachana Umashankar has been beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think, hold on.